Hello, this is the Kubernetes office hours. It is Wednesday, February 7th, talking about high availability, self-hosting, and upgrades. We'll start with some agenda items. Lee, you wanted to talk about the UX for etcd?
Yeah, this should hopefully be pretty short. I wanted to bring this up in the community forum to make sure that if people have strong opinions or interesting suggestions.
It's a little hard to hear you, Lee. I don't know if you can.
Is this better or?
A little better.
Can you hear me now? Okay. I wanted to bring up the UX of using kubeadm with etcd and etcd clusters in this group, so that if anybody has useful suggestions or opinions, that we could kind of look forward to making this a more documented and user-supported story. Currently, right now, with our static pod documented way of spinning up a multi-node Kubernetes cluster, etcd is kind of a prerequisite that you should have your own etcd cluster you bring to the table, and that kubeadm will be responsible for spinning up or for bootstrapping and maintaining the lifecycle of the multi-node control plane. This is definitely a disconnect. It's a higher barrier entry to people who are inexperienced with operating all of the components of Kubernetes. And so Tim and I had some conversations while we were doing backlog maintenance about what it would look like to provide a good user experience for people in bootstrapping the etcd cluster, potentially a multi-node etcd cluster with kubeadm. And we had some interesting questions about whether people think that this is in scope, what level of proposal we need to kind of bring forward. I also talked a little bit with Lucas about this. And when we were going over things, we kind of realized that with the work that I need to finish pushing through for generating TLS certificates for all of the etcd components, and then combining that with the control plane basis command, it might already be very possible to, with the proper configurations, kind of orchestrate bootstrapping multi-node clustering for etcd in the same way that we kind of use kubeadm to hack together a highly available multi-node control plane. So that's kind of where we ended up on that, and the first action item that I can take away is to try to hack on that, get a workflow working for bootstrapping multi-node etcd using kubeadm only, and then see where we can go from there, if we can update the user-facing docs that we have right now for a highly available cluster. And from there, I wanted to open up the floor for anybody who has opinions or maybe to clarify any questions.
Might want to mute in between. Lucas and several other folks and Jamie have had several docs on this topic, and I think after the operator being pulled, that Lucas's last doc on how he proposed doing HA is probably the most accurate, but there's overlap with some of the work that Fabrizio is doing. I think what might make a lot of sense here is I'm totally cool with POCs that we can demonstrate, and Fabrizio did that with his too as well as having a doc for us to hash on in the KEP repository also makes good sense. That way we attack it from both angles. And I also wanted to perhaps make sure that folks had a chance to look through Fabrizio's doc. I think most of the major issues with Fabrizio's doc have been addressed. I want to take one more pass through it sometime this week and possibly have the notion of gating it so that way we can at least have like some gated mechanism to allow the evolution of joining multiple masters together. And that will of course also involve a control plane. There's going to have to be this mishmash of these two bits together, right? Now, the one thing that I think we cannot do with etcd is we cannot self-host it. Right. I think the lesson in the etcd operator is that it's too thorny, and we don't want to be piloting that space if other people have treaded down there and they have pulled the ejector handle. So I think the happy path that we currently have is static manifests, right? And I'm totally okay with the notion. We'll have to answer the upgrade question along with this, and I'm totally okay with having like a daemon set or a manager utility or some other thing that can update those static manifests to pull in later versions and possibly upgrade the args too. I do know that there are other people who are trying to create tooling for managing etcd, and there's so much tooling I don't know where to begin or end. But what I would like to do ideally is anything that is etcd related to kind of parcel off into a library, because we kind of have this intermingling of code and phases and other bits. And I think if we kind of push some of the management aspects of the code, this is a logistical request. If we push some of those other management aspects of etcd into its own library, it'll make life for everyone else a little bit easier, because at least all these other people who are doing these things will have a widget by which we can agree to disagree upon. Then from there, how the actual management of the certs gets stood up and how that data gets passed, that can be open to debate. Does that seem reasonable? I know I said many things there. And that package could be leveraged in phases, right? How the certs get passed around, that was a topic of much heated conversation for a long time. I don't know if Lucas mentioned anything to you about what he thought was the best way. I know that passing over CRDs was like the last option in absence of using secrets.
Cool. Yeah. Well, so definitely hear you on the difficulties of self-hosting etcd. I've also talked with Ilya a little bit about this, and all of the self-hosted components, are definitely more of a pilot state than what we've been doing tried and true release after release with the static pod manifests. And so making the story a little bit more mature, I think it's definitely worth trying a POC to see what we can do with things like etcd extra args in the config, and just using the control plane etcd phase to try and spin up just the etcd pod to see what Kubernetes can do and if it's reasonable to try and tell users to do.
You might want to look at, I don't know if you were on the yesterday's meeting.
I was not.
You might want to take a look at, you don't need to, there's some very opinionated bits inside there, but Justin Santa Barbara created his own little etcd manager, right? But you might want to take a look at there for some of the problems that he may have bumped into. I don't necessarily know if you'll agree to all of the other constructs that he used to solve the problem, because in kubeadm we try to do like be minimalistic and not buy into other ideas or technologies that we'd have to subsume in order to make the facility more usable. We kind of like punt on that stuff. We want to be as minimalistic as we can be.
Yeah, and maybe I'll make a note about this, but like my initial thoughts are that what's most obvious to be in scope for kubeadm is any of the etcd bits where you need to know about Kubernetes and what Kubernetes requires from etcd in order for it to work, right? And so that's all of the bits that we usually do when we set up a single node etcd static pod. So can that scope be expanded to where we can split it up into multiple user phases where it can be orchestrated into one cluster in the same way that we ask people to like distribute certs and try to get that spun up with the load ones.
Yeah, I'm totally cool and supportive of creating a POC and a doc that goes along with it. I do think we spent a lot of time navel gazing on documentation. We have done a lot of that. So I think as long as you have a sane answer for how you want to do certs, that is the hardest problem. And if you have a sane answer for that, which the most sane answer that didn't cause everyone to lose it was to use CRDs as almost like an FTP transport. That was Lucas's proposal. It's not crazy, but it's not clean either, right? Like ideally we want to leverage secrets, but there's no clean mechanics for that, right? Like the secrets aren't secret was the problem, right? And this is the keys to the kingdom once you have the certs to etcd.
I have a question about the etcd UX, because in kubeadmin we typically bind the etcd member with the master node. My question is, we want to keep and go on maintaining this assumption, or also imagine a UX that allows us to create an etcd cluster with kubeadmin separated by the master nodes?
I think that should be possible with just the etcd control plane phase. Like after kind of looking through things, it seems doable, but nobody has really tried and at least documented that they tried it. Like you should be able to install kubeadm and install the etcd binaries on nodes and just use the etcd certs phase and the control plane etcd phase.
I think
Just spin up those pods.
I think that would greatly simplify the existing doc, and it would allow us it's like a step forwards that would allow us to potentially get to the integration, the final integration, which would be like stand up master join, stand up master join, stand up master join.
Yeah, I was thinking that I would first try it with etcd on the nodes that share the control plane, but I like what Fabrice is suggesting, which is that this is also something that could be located separate from the control plane, and that could
That's actually the way most people deploy for production environments. Is the etcd nodes are separate, right? Like when I recommended scale out deployments for other people, we've done a lot of rigorous testing at scale and found that there are a bunch of conflating issues that occur when you have all the things on a single node, right? And having your backend CP storage facility in an isolated environment with dedicated resources, hey, that's a good idea. I really like the idea of having a separate phases command that allows you to do it. That would shrink that doc. I think that's a good step, a good point forwards that is actually something that we can accomplish. Without us discussing what the word is, right?
Yeah, I mean, when I talked to Lucas about it, he told me that it's possible to use the control plane phase to just start the etcd static pod. So we might already have all of the work done. This is probably not even any code to get a POC working.
Well, you're going to have to do the certs business, right?
The certs business, I'll use my existing PR. because that'll be the shared CA. And then I think just extra args will be enough to glue everything together. And that's not ideal.
I'd happily review it, and I'm sure it sounds like Fabrizio is probably interested too as well.
Cool. Well, it sounds like there's plenty of sentiment towards this, and have a few action items. So we'll probably move on to the next agenda.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lee. Much appreciated. Martin?
Yep. Well, I don't have so much to say. It is basically something that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, upgrading an HA cluster built around something that was bootstrapped using kubeadm. And so I've done some research on that, documented my findings, also implemented some Ansible code, and published that on Google Docs and GitHub respectively. I would like some feedback if somebody cares to take a look at it and could just tell me what he thinks about it. But B, we talked about putting some of that stuff, some of that information on kubenetes.io to make this information available from a more official source. I think Jamie was kind of in charge of that. But, well, yes, I haven't received any new information on that. Just wanted to know if there is still any plans to put some of that stuff on kubenetes.io, and who's going to do it then, of course.
The initial stand-up is already on kubenetes.io. That already exists there, but the upgrade scenario is not, right? And I will happily take a look at the doc. And I think this kind of will mash and overlap with Lee's work too as well. There isn't, I'd have to take a look at the phases about upgrading I know we punted on it, and my memory is escaping me right now about how we do upgrades with etcd. I know they're done separately. So let me do some homework here on this, and we can also chat on Slack to verify how upgrades should be handled. But I think after we vetted your doc, I'd happily take a look at any PRs to the main docs to have a separate subsection about, like, here's how you stood it up, here's how you upgrade it. And then we can refine that over time. And we could also point to, I know the kubeadm repo lives on its own island. Do you have, what tooling do you have? Ansible scripts like that swizzle everything around, or?
Well, the Ansible is basically kind of a reference implementation of what I documented. So I usually do that along with the stuff that I document. Actually, I'm not taking any look at upgrading etcd because the etcd is running externally anyway, so that's beyond scope for kubeadm anyway. So that's totally separate.
Oh, this is just upgrading the control plane for high availability?
Well, yes, the whole cluster, basically. Ending at the point where you have upgraded all the RPMs or whatever you have installed.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I can take a look at that. That's not as hard.
Yep. And also, I found the documentation that ended up at kubenetes.io rather terse when it comes to the install of or bootstrap of a HA cluster. Maybe it could use some more information. I mean, Jamie really stuck to installing basically the binaries by hand. There is no distribution integration or anything like that. I don't know if it's worthwhile doing that. It's for a transitional period anyway, but just wanted to mention that.
Well, we're always welcome to PRs and comment on them and loop in the SIG Cluster Lifecycle PR reviews, that element. And usually it's better to push up a PR and then we can take a look at it and talk about it in the SIG, than to try to ask here first, because sometimes either we're so busy with other stuff, it's difficult to make sense out of everything. But if we have the PR up, it's something to chat about to needle on during this time, which is high bandwidth.
Okay, Can.
Something that I am uneducated about is, so the Kubernetes binaries, like the Kubernetes package, is a requirement for kubeadm. But what does that look like when somebody wants to run like a containerized kubelet or something like that?
That gets weird. That's kind of like that's kind of like the zeroth order of self-hosting, containerized kubelets. And we kind of willfully punt on that because it takes on a host of other problems. And we've know a set of what those problems are. And I don't think anyone besides Mirantis does some of this stuff, and they did it in KubeSpray. And the reason a lot of people don't do this is just because of the problems that occur. Like there used to be issues with host volume mount stuff, because if you're going to have a self-hosted kubelet, right, that's when you get into this weird space where like you have to mount the whole system pieces into the kubelet, and then it gets into this weird permissions model and a security vortex that gets very confusing to people. So if you have a system unit file, it kind of makes it very clear that this is the process that is owning it and the parent tree that it belongs to. It becomes a little bit weird when you start like root mounting things into the other container, and then it becomes even more weird when you need to do volume mounting, right? So now you've root mounted these things inside there, and now you need to do volume mounts on the root mount, right? It's kind of like the more layers you get, it gets weirder and weirder. And most people have avoided that because of when they view nodes, because the nodes are the hard part where you require the RPM or deb update, right? They view those almost as immutable. If you view it as an immutable image, right? And then you just like, you coordinate and drain the nodes, and then you just spin up a new one with a brand new image. That's usually the best operating model that I've seen, because that way you're not, the idea of live upgrading a cluster sounds good, but it's a terrible idea in practice, because it becomes over time, you get these bits that are hard to maintain and manage, versus having a immutable piece of your infrastructure that you coordinate and drain, and then you spin up a new one to replace it, right? And you do that in sort of like a rolling fashion.
Yeah, I think something interesting that Mirantis also does that I don't completely understand is with the DND cluster, they use system D in the container, and then they just have all of the binaries and treat it like a node. And I know that there's some consideration, or that there's some flags configuration necessary to make that happen.
Yeah, that's some.
Listening to Martin talk, that I realized there were some things that I didn't know.
That's some voodoo. There's aspects that work in DIND clusters, and there's things that don't, right? Depends, like people have Docker and Docker and Docker, people have Docker and Docker, but this is like weird space of it's good for testing certain things. And ideally I want to get to the space where we're talking about this in another SIG, where we want to have a infrastructure for spinning up a Docker in Docker jig as part of integration tests for broader people who use Kubernetes as a bed, right? Like they don't care about it, but they want to have an integration test framework that basically says like, give me this cluster and give me back a handle to a client. That's all I care about. And that's a highly useful atomic widget that other people could reuse across, people are creating their own controllers, people are creating their own things, they just want to have an integration test bed. But the space of full self-hosting with kubelet on kubelet, that is something we have willfully avoided, because there's a whole host of issues that arise from it. It's useful for these test beds, but not, I don't know anyone that hasn't run into issues in production. I did want to chat quickly about Fabrizio's doc, if folks had a chance to take a look at it. If there's any PSAs that Fabrizio might have with regards to that doc. It's basically outlining the potential UX as well as his POC for just the master components and joining them. Could you paste a link to your, I think I actually have it here. It's a community pull request. I'll paste it here. It's a race. I think the only topic that the only contentious thing I had on that doc was whether or not we want to force the idea of self-hosted. And you kind of answered my question, Fabrizio, that like the way the world is today is we don't want to force people into that if they're not ready. And there's a lot of legacy. So if you want to be able to join an existing set of static manifests.
Yes, and today I went through the PR about audit policies.
Yep.
And this PR creates another dependency between the API server and the file system, because the API server need to access the API policy file.
Yeah, which would, for self-hosting, means yet another host volume out.
Yes, and for the full self-hosting, so the self-hosting that automatically replicates on new nodes, you need to use, I don't know, config maps instead of files.
Yes.
And this creates another point for the checkpointing.
So I'm kind of getting to this point now where the idea of having a daemon set upgrader almost seems cleaner to me. Now, other people can sway me against it, but I think the promise of self-hosting was that you get these magical things for free, but the logistics are painful, right? Where, you know, a daemon set upgrader or revisioner is actually something that other people do anyways today, and it's not a terrible pattern. It is not as nice as saying, like, you know, roll the update to the masters and magic happens, but it is a way for that, you know, to have a controlled upgrade. Has anyone thought or taken a look at a POC there of just having like a simple, you'd almost even have like, you just be calling kubeadm upgrade on as a job versus as a job with a taint that targets the masters and has host privileges.
I think that when I saw the demo about the cluster API at KubeConf, I don't know if you have had a chance. I saw that this pattern is really powerful. The cluster that changes itself. But when I think at kubeadmin doing this, the difficulties is that kubeadmin needs to be deployed on the machine, cannot be only a controller deployed once that calls the Google Cloud API or whatever. So the logistics is much more complex. You need to be deployed on each nodes and to have full root grants, basically. And even if you do this, you have to manage the initial bootstrap as a command line. So the story, I think that it is a sound solution because it addresses many problems, from upgrade, from copy of things, whatever. but I'm worried about the complexity that jump ins, because you have to manage the bootstrap and then the daemon sets. So I'm worried that at the end Kubernetes became 2 times the same bunch of code, one time for the CLI and the other for the demo set. So and what most worries me is that kubeadmin phases now are not really an API. They are not cleanly separated from the CLI. So it is not easy to invoke them. So it is an interesting path, but how to get there is not easy.
Yeah, this is the self-hosting bit sounds good, like you mentioned, but I think the idea of providing, if we have the ability to basically lay down the control plane and make it easy, have a master join, as well as having the etcd cluster easily configured. I think the management of the upgrades could be done as pods running on the system that have host volume mount privileges and just call the upgrade. I think that is almost simpler than trying to do host volume mounts or trying to do self-hosting, right? Because I can do that today and I already do that on other systems, right?
Tim, do you think that they would need to use CRDs as locks?
You wouldn't have to. Like if you said kubeadm upgrade, like if I was on the command line and did kubeadm upgrade, I could first list down who are the masters, right? And I could specifically target a node selector that has the taint, that runs a job on that machine and just literally grabs the logs as it runs and only goes on to the next node once that one is done. It only does it one at a time. And then it could back off,
okay.
you know, because kubeadm is command line driven and CLI driven, instead of me just like blindly flashing the whole system, it could query the system and say, this is what we have, this is the configuration we have, and I will go through A, B, C, one step at a time, nice and smooth, almost like as if it were a very explicit rollout through Ansible, right?
Yeah, it would be a blocking CLI operation. So
blocking
an asynchronous submission.
Exactly. It'd be very imperative. It would be imperative driven, which isn't a bad thing for master upgrades. I don't think that's bad.
Oh, and it's a building block as well, or it has the opportunity to be like not the end state.
Yep.
It could be, but then like if we do that and it doesn't,
because
better,
yeah.
change.
Because kubeadm knows itself, right? So if I build the command line utility, it's the same thing as what we're doing on a separate project for Heptio called Sonobuoy, where you do Sonobuoy run, and Sonobuoy composes its own configuration that will then be deployed to the cluster, right? You could do that with upgrade, where upgrade then composes its configuration of its job that it needs to run 1, and then it does 2, and then it does 3, and then it's done, right? And if it fails at any one of those things, you could have a staged rollback for the upgrade on that individual node, right? The upgrade command for the job that was on the node or on the master would be to look at the master configuration and push it to this location, and then if it fails to do the upgrade and come back in a timely fashion, then it just resets it back to 0, and it does that today anyways, right? So it has the rollback capabilities for one single node.
So basically, kubeadmin is use daemon setter jobs to go on the node, do the upgrade, and then return. Okay, I understood. The tricky part is that this process is driven by the client.
Yeah, you would have a client that would be running locally, and it would literally like stream back the logs of the state of everything, of each individual upgrade. Upgrade node A, here's all the state of kubeadm upgrade, and then that's complete, node A done, onto node B, same pattern.
Yes, yes, but this client needs to be capable to restart from failures. This is the tricky part.
That could be built into, yeah, there's going to be a tricky part of like what happens if you're on node B and that upgrade succeeds, or that upgrade fails, but node A did not, right? That's the tricky part, right? But you know, for the most part, if we build in single fault tolerance failure, you know, like on a given node, that could be like the first step. And the second step could be a, you know, we'd have to deal with the scenario of walking it back up the chain. But I think this is a path that we could do today. I don't think there's anything that stops us today that we'd have to build in for features that we could even prototype and get it working, that gets the upgrade of a highly available control plane in a non-suck state, right? Because right now the upgrade scenarios, as well as dealing with the edge cases for self-hosted, are just thorny, as you mentioned before, Fabrizio.
Now, this is an interesting next step for upgrades. I think that there is a spot in the upgrade history which is that should be clarified. That is that now the upgrades use the kubeadm config map.
Yes.
And if I'm not wrong, there are some information in this config map which are not node specific, because this config map was designed basically when there was only one master.
Yeah.
And this is something that I'm curious to check in the document how this was solved, because otherwise you risk to lose the API server address, which is important, which is specific of the master node, and the node name. At least there are those two variables. So I think that another area of improvement of the upgrade history or UX is to make the upgrade history ready for HA or for multi-master.
I don't know what pieces are missing inside the config or what things are needed.
No, basically, there is nothing missing, but some information are specific, are not cluster related, but are related to a specific node.
Yeah, I get that.
So when you init your first node, you write the API server advertised address and the node name, node 1. Then you init the second master and you override those information. When you do upgrades, then you are in a tricky position, because you can do upgrade only on the second node but not on the first node. If you do upgrade on the first node, you bring in on the first node the advertised address and the node name of the second one. So,
well, this depends how we're doing HA, but yes, I see your point, because you could have a DNS name as your advertised address or a VIP.
Yes, for instance, I use a workaround to this problem for the advertised address. That is to use the same advertised address for all the nodes.
Yep.
But still, there is an open problem, which is the node name of the node, which can be overridden. So it is another point that we have to look at.
Okay. Is there a tracking issue for that one? Because we're talking about this, that we should.
No, I think no. This was in my notes about the HA prototype, but I will write an issue, so we keep track of this.
I'm trying to take notes here for a second. Okay. I think what I might do, which I think I kind of have to do, is write down a doc that we can rally on for what it means to do upgrades for a highly available control plane in a non-self-hosted world, and a potential workflow there. And maybe we can use that as a discussion for next week during this call. And in the interim, I think, for folks to take a look at Fabrizio's doc, because that workflow is independent, I think, of the upgrades. That's just the initial joining.
Yes.
Yeah, and then
and by design it's also independent from etcd.
Yep.
Because I tried to split the problem in small chunk.
No, I like that. I like that a lot because otherwise we just kept on going in circles, right? And Lee, if you wanted to work on that other bit with regards to, there's multiple pieces there, but if you wanted to prototype as well as lay down a doc of how you envision some of the flow working together, I think all of these pieces kind of align and are moving the ball forwards, which I think is good. I will happily review any PRs to the main Google Doc too, and I'll try to loop in Jamie. Jamie's been pretty responsive now that he's back at home, working from home. So.
Cool. I will finish up the SCDT plus PR commands for the second round of deploys, and then that'll be the next thing to work on. You said PR against the main Google Doc. What does that mean?
I said PR against the main Google Doc. I meant you can write a KEP for how you propose to control the main UX flow for standing up etcd separately.
Cool. So just write a KEP saying what we want and how we could potentially use any existing features or potential learnings.
Yeah, I think this is a nice interim state. I like this because we're dealing with just the masters now. We have just that flow. We have just etcd and just that flow. And we'll talk about just upgrades and just that flow. I like that a lot. And we're gonna wash our hands right now of self-hosting, just because of as you mentioned, as we add more pieces to the puzzle here, like the audit log, it requires more issues and more mounts to be managed with the self-hosting scenario.
Cool, I like it.
Me too. I'm actually pretty optimistic now. It's a good place to be. Are there any other comments?
If we are finished with HA and etcd, I want to share an idea that I'm starting to working on, and it is something related to the flags, the amount of flags, and the amount of UX that we have. So basically, what I'm concerned is that now we have a huge amount of flags, and we have a huge amount of, and the same flags are duplicated in Kubernetes init and in phases. We with really a little value added, I think. So basically, I'm thinking
I think it's harder to maintain.
It's hard to maintain. I started implementing most of the phases following the one or two that were there when I started, but now I recognize that this is not easy to maintain. So what I'm thinking about is to have a kubeadmin init and then an argument that if it is empty, it means all the phases. Otherwise, you do kubeadmin init certs, kubeadmin init kubeconfig. So the idea I'm working on is to collapse phases into init. So the reuser the code will be as much as possible. And I don't know if you like the idea or not. So I want to share these. I write in the chat. Basically, now we do kubeadmin init, and this means all. But if we allow the user to do kubeadmin init certs, that means that the user wants to create only the certs. Or if the user does kubeadmin init certs and kubeconfig, he wants to execute these two steps. And we can play around at this idea to provide arg to kubeadmin ini in order to shrink the list of phases that kubeadmin executes. But the benefits behind this will be that at the end we will clean up the code and basically delete all the phases and have only kubeadmin init a little bit more structured.
I like it, but I think it's going to require other people to have it. We do need to do this in the broader SIG meeting.
No, of course. If there,
right now
I brought an enhancement proposal also for this, yeah. And do a little bit of prototyping as soon as I don't know if next week I will have time. But first of all, I want to figure out how this can be done, because I studied a little bit how kubectl does this. And there are also many interesting things that we can reuse. For instance, kubectl uses a kind of factory, which is reused across many commands to build the client, connect Kubernetes, to build everything, all the support, the validation, everything is supported. And now also this code is duplicated in many parts.
Well, there's both good ideas in kube control as well as some terrible ones. So we want to be careful to take the good ideas where we can and make sure that the code is clean in kubeadm. But I do have grave concerns that we should not go to GA with the proliferation of flags and mechanisms that we have currently. Because I do think that what will happen is, as people start to depend upon this more, they will ask for more and more flags, which is what we're seeing, right? That your spreadsheet that you created, which is awesome, by the way, thank you, is basically everyone asking for more flags because they have these use cases of like, we need to tweak the knobs here, we need to tweak the knobs there. And I think minimizing the duplication of flags, that's super helpful, because as you saw with some other PRs, is if a person wanted to add a flag to all the phases because they were part of it, they'd have to duplicate the flags and all the tooling.
Yes, because there are 2 dimensions in the Excel sheet. I want to cut one.
Exactly.
Sure.
Yeah. So I love the idea. I think logistically we need to figure it out, but I do think I want to add that as a blocking. Like we should open an issue on the kubeadm repo, and I want to put this as like a blocking issue for GA, right? So you know how we have a GA milestone now? I would like to put that in the GA milestone, because I think that's super important for long-term maintenance of this tool. And I think us being a little extra conservative and in promoting to GA is not a bad thing, because we've seen what happens when people promote things too early.
Yes, this could be part of making GA the phases or beta the phases.
Cool. I like it. I like it a lot. I think we're actually at time too, or 4 minutes till time. Is there any last minute topics that folks want to discuss? No, this was a good meeting. Lots of heavy stuff. I'm happy about this one. Martin, feel free to PR. I'll take a look at your doc too as well. And Lee, we have a backlog of things to go through. And if folks have a chance, I'd really appreciate feedback on Fabrizio's master join. And I'm really hopeful that all these separate pieces can kind of jive and mash together over time. So
okay.
That if no one else has any other comments, I think we can call it a meeting. Cool.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.